213 BCE in ancient China, Emperor Qin Shi Huang made a decision that would echo through history as one of the most systematic attempts to control human knowledge ever recorded. The emperor didn't just want to rule his people's bodies, he wanted to control their minds. His solution was breathtakingly simple and absolutely brutal. Burn every book in the empire except those dealing with agriculture, medicine, and divination. This wasn't the impulsive act of a mad ruler. This was strategic warfare against ideas themselves. Qin Shi Huang understood something that modern dictators would later rediscover. If you control what people can read, you control what they can think. If you control what they can think, you control everything. The emperor's scholars protested, arguing that destroying books would eliminate thousands of years of accumulated wisdom. His response was to bury 460 scholars alive and proceed with the burning. But here's what makes this case particularly chilling. The books that survived this purge were specifically chosen to keep people focused on practical, non-threatening subjects. Agriculture keeps people fed and productive. Medicine keeps them healthy and working. Divination keeps them looking to approved authorities for guidance about the future. Everything else, every text that might inspire independent thought, political resistance, or alternative ways of organizing society, went up in flames. The emperor's campaign succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. Entire schools of Chinese philosophy vanished overnight. Historical records that might have challenged his version of events disappeared forever. Scientific treatises, poetry, literature, political theory, all of it reduced to ash. When Qin Shi Huang died just a few years later, the intellectual foundation of Chinese civilization had been systematically demolished. What survived tells us everything about the nature of forbidden knowledge. The books that made it through weren't necessarily the best or most important. They were the safest. They posed no threat to authority. They asked no uncomfortable questions. They challenged no established power structures. This pattern of survival would repeat itself throughout history, creating a distorted record where the most dangerous ideas are precisely the ones that disappear. Moving forward several centuries, we encounter what many consider the greatest intellectual catastrophe in human history. The destruction of the Library of Alexandria represents not just the loss of individual books, but the obliteration of humanity's first attempt at universal knowledge collection. When those flames consumed hundreds of thousands of scrolls, they destroyed something irreplaceable: the accumulated wisdom of the ancient world. The Library of Alexandria wasn't just a building filled with books. It was humanity's memory bank. Ptolemaic rulers had implemented an aggressive policy of knowledge acquisition that bordered on obsessive. Officials searched every ship entering Alexandria's harbour, confiscating any books they found. They would copy the texts, then decide whether to return the originals or keep them for the collection. Sometimes they kept both copies. The library contained works from Syria, Persia, India, and civilizations we can barely imagine today because their knowledge was lost when Alexandria burned. Greek literature, Egyptian science, Mesopotamian mathematics, Persian philosophy, all of it gathered in one place, all of it vulnerable to a single catastrophic event. Modern scholars estimate that between 40,000 and 700,000 books were housed in the library, representing the intellectual output of dozens of civilizations across thousands of years. What makes the destruction of Alexandria particularly tragic is that we know just enough about what was lost to understand how much we don't know. Ancient sources reference scientific treatises that describe technologies we're only rediscovering today. Mathematical works that solve problems we still struggle with. Historical accounts of civilizations that vanished from the record when their books burned. Philosophical texts that might have offered entirely different ways of understanding existence itself. The debate over who destroyed Alexandria continues to this day. Julius Caesar is often blamed for setting fires that spread from the harbour to the library during his occupation in 48 BCE. Others point to Christian zealots who viewed pagan knowledge as dangerous to their faith. Still others argue that the library died a slower death through neglect and gradual decay. But the specific cause matters less than the broader pattern it represents. When knowledge becomes concentrated in a single location, it becomes vulnerable to total destruction. What survived the burning of Alexandria tells the same story we saw in ancient China. The safest texts made it through. The most challenging ideas disappeared. Religious works that supported established orthodoxy survived, while texts that questioned religious authority vanished. Political treatises that reinforced existing power structures endured while revolutionary ideas were lost forever. This brings us to one of the most calculated and systematic book destruction campaigns in modern history. The Nazi book burnings of 1933 didn't happen spontaneously. They were carefully planned and precisely executed events designed to reshape German culture according to Nazi ideology. What makes these burnings particularly disturbing is their public, celebratory nature. This wasn't secret destruction carried out in dark corners. This was mass entertainment. In May 1933, coordinated book burnings took place in more than 20 university towns across Nazi Germany. Students marched through streets shouting slogans, gathering at central locations where they had constructed massive bonfires. Surrounded by cheering crowds, they threw tens of thousands of books into the flames while chanting ritualistic slogans designed to give the campaign a celebratory character. The books chosen for destruction reveal the Nazi understanding of which ideas posed the greatest threat to their movement. Works by Jewish authors like Albert Einstein and Sigmund Freud went up in flames alongside American authors such as Ernest Hemingway and Helen Keller. The writings of Karl Marx and Karl Kautsky were among the first to burn, but the campaign quickly expanded to include any book incompatible with Nazi ideology. What's particularly chilling about the Nazi book burnings is their precision. Each book fell under specific categories: Bolshevist literature, Jewish democratic works, morally depraved texts. The Nazis didn't just want to destroy individual books, they wanted to eliminate entire categories of thought. They understood that ideas are contagious, that dangerous thoughts spread through populations like viruses, and that the only way to stop ideological infection is to eliminate the carriers. Helen Keller, whose books were among those burning in German bonfires, wrote a prophetic response to the German students responsible. She warned them that history had taught them nothing if they thought they could kill ideas. Tyrants had tried to destroy ideas before, she reminded them, and those ideas had risen up in their might and destroyed the tyrants instead. You can burn books and destroy the works of the best minds, but the ideas contained in those books had already seeped through millions of channels and would continue to quicken other minds. The international response to the Nazi book burnings was swift and condemnatory. 100,000 people marched in New York City to protest Nazi policies, with similar demonstrations in Philadelphia, Chicago, and St. Louis. American media called it a Holocaust of books, a bibliocaust that foreshadowed the human Holocaust that would follow. Because here's what makes the Nazi book burnings so significant for understanding forbidden knowledge. They served as an early warning system. The same ideology that viewed certain books as too dangerous to exist would soon view certain people as too dangerous to live. The destruction of ideas preceded and enabled the destruction of human beings. When a society decides that some thoughts are so threatening they must be eliminated entirely, it's a short step to deciding that the people who think those thoughts must be eliminated as well. This pattern of escalation, from book burning to human persecution, appears throughout history. It's not coincidence. It's cause and effect. When authorities successfully establish that certain ideas are too dangerous for public consumption, they create the intellectual framework for more extreme forms of suppression. If thoughts can be forbidden, then the people who think those thoughts become enemies of the state. The Nazi book burnings also demonstrate how modern technology and mass media can amplify the destructive power of censorship campaigns. Unlike ancient book burnings that affected limited geographic areas, the Nazi campaign was coordinated across an entire nation, documented on film, and broadcast to international audiences. The efficiency and scale of destruction possible in the modern era far exceeded anything attempted in previous centuries. The systematic nature of the Nazi book destruction reveals something even more disturbing about how forbidden knowledge operates in the modern world. The Nazis didn't just burn books randomly. They created detailed lists, categorized threats, and implemented what amounted to an industrial approach to idea elimination. This wasn't passionate mob violence. This was bureaucratic efficiency applied to intellectual murder. What survived the Nazi bonfires follows that same pattern we've seen throughout history. Technical manuals remained untouched. Agricultural handbooks were preserved. Medical textbooks continued circulating. But anything that challenged Nazi racial theory, questioned authoritarian government, or promoted international cooperation went up in flames. The message was clear. Knowledge that serves the state is acceptable. Knowledge that questions the state is forbidden. This brings us to perhaps the longest-running and most sophisticated book censorship operation in human history. For over 4 centuries, from 1559 to 1966, the Catholic Church maintained something called the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Forbidden Books. This wasn't just a list of banned titles. This was a comprehensive system for controlling what Catholics worldwide were allowed to read, think, and believe. The index represented the Church's systematic attempt to maintain intellectual control over roughly 1/3 of the world's population. The first index was published in 1559 by the Sacred Congregation of the Roman Inquisition, specifically designed to combat Protestant Reformation writings that were spreading dangerous ideas about religious authority and individual conscience. What makes the index particularly revealing is its scope. This wasn't limited to theological disputes. The Church banned love stories, philosophical treatises, political theory, scientific works, and historical accounts. They prohibited entire categories of human thought. All writings by certain authors were completely forbidden, including works by David Hume, Thomas Hobbes, Émile Zola, and Jean-Paul Sartre. Nearly every major Western philosopher found their works censored, including Erasmus, René Descartes, Immanuel Kant, George Berkeley, Voltaire, Edward Gibbon, and Montesquieu. The Church understood something that modern censors would later rediscover. You don't need to burn every dangerous book. You just need to make people afraid to read them. Catholics who dared read books on the index risked excommunication and spiritual damnation. The threat of eternal punishment proved far more effective than physical destruction at controlling access to forbidden knowledge. But here's where the index reveals the true nature of intellectual control. The compilation process involved rigorous examination by censors who evaluated works for theological errors, moral corruption, or challenges to church authority. These weren't random prohibitions. They were surgical strikes against specific ideas that threatened established power structures. The scientific works banned by the index tell a particularly revealing story. Nicholas Copernicus found his revolutionary astronomical theories forbidden because they challenged the Earth-centered universe that supported church cosmology. Galileo Galilei's works were banned after he provided evidence supporting Copernican theory. The Church understood that scientific discoveries could undermine religious authority by offering alternative explanations for natural phenomena. What's fascinating is how the Church handled these scientific challenges over time. The Inquisition's ban on Galileo's works was quietly lifted in 1718, decades after the scientific community had accepted his findings. All traces of official opposition to heliocentrism disappeared in 1835 when these works were finally dropped from the index. The Church had learned that some ideas become too powerful to suppress indefinitely. Better to quietly retreat than face public humiliation. This pattern of delayed acceptance reveals something crucial about how forbidden knowledge works. Authorities often ban ideas not because they're false, but because they're true and threatening. The Church didn't prohibit Galileo's work because his science was wrong. They banned it because his science was right, and that truth challenged their version of reality. The index also demonstrates how censorship evolves with changing times. Early editions focused primarily on Protestant theological works. Later versions expanded to include Enlightenment philosophy, Romantic literature, and modern political theory. The Church adapted its censorship strategies to address new threats as they emerged, always staying one step ahead of dangerous ideas. Moving from religious censorship to literary persecution, we encounter one of the most famous banned books in modern history. James Joyce's Ulysses faced systematic suppression that reveals how obscenity laws can be weaponized to eliminate challenging art. The obscenity trial over Ulysses occurred in 1921 and effectively banned publication in the United States after the Little Review published a controversial episode featuring sexual content. What makes the Ulysses case particularly significant is how authorities used moral panic to justify intellectual censorship. The book was branded as pornographic and blasphemous, despite being recognized by literary experts as a groundbreaking work of art. W.B. Yeats, T.S. Eliot, and Ezra Pound found the censorship absurd, while legislators and journalists considered it a work of perversion. The trial focused on a specific episode involving protagonist Leopold Bloom's sexual fantasies. The prosecution argued that Joyce's metaphorical language constituted obscene material that would corrupt public morals. The defense strategy proved woefully inadequate, with Joyce's own lawyer confessing that he didn't understand the work and suggesting that incomprehensibility was due to the author's poor eyesight. For 12 years, Ulysses remained banned in the United States, available only through smuggled copies from Paris. This created a black market for literary contraband that demonstrated how censorship can actually increase demand for forbidden knowledge. The more authorities tried to suppress Joyce's work, the more people wanted to read it. The breakthrough came with a carefully orchestrated legal challenge in 1933. Random House and the American Civil Liberties Union arranged a test case, deliberately shipping the book to New York, where customs officials seized it upon arrival. The case was fortunate to be assigned to U.S. District Judge John Woolsey, who ruled that Ulysses was not pornographic, but rather a serious literary work, employing innovative stream of consciousness techniques. Judge Woolsey's decision transformed American literary censorship and established important precedents for artistic expression. His ruling recognized that challenging or uncomfortable art doesn't automatically constitute obscenity. This legal precedent would prove crucial for defending controversial works in subsequent decades. The Ulysses case reveals how obscenity laws can be manipulated to suppress ideas that have nothing to do with sexual morality. Joyce's real crime wasn't writing sexually explicit material. His crime was revolutionizing literary form in ways that challenged conventional thinking about narrative, consciousness, and reality itself. The sexual content provided a convenient excuse for censoring a work that was actually threatening because of its artistic innovation. This pattern of using moral outrage to justify intellectual suppression continues today in more sophisticated forms. Modern book banning campaigns often focus on sexual content or inappropriate language, while the real target is the challenging ideas those books contain. Whether it's Joyce's experimental literature or contemporary works addressing racism and social justice, the dynamic remains consistent. Authorities identify the most controversial elements of a work, generate public outrage around those elements, then use that outrage to justify eliminating the entire text. The evolution from historical censorship to modern book banning reveals how these tactics adapt to changing social conditions while maintaining the same fundamental goal. Control over what people can read means control over what they can think. Control over what they can think means control over how they understand reality itself. contemporary book banning efforts have reached unprecedented scales and levels of coordination. PEN America documented nearly 23,000 book bans in public schools nationwide since 2021, with specific targeting of books addressing race, racism, and LGBTQ+ issues. This represents more than simple moral panic. This is systematic intellectual warfare designed to eliminate challenging perspectives from public discourse. The targeting is remarkably precise and ideologically driven. 40% of banned books include characters of color, while 21% portray issues of race and racism. Well-known works like To Kill a Mockingbird and Adventures of Huckleberry Finn face challenges alongside contemporary authors writing about modern social issues. The American Library Association documented over 1,200 attempts to censor library books and materials in 2023, representing a 65% increase from the previous year. What makes modern censorship particularly dangerous is its coordinated nature. National and local groups with extreme conservative views have organized systematic campaigns to exert ideological control over public education. They use consistent tactics, exploit parental fears and anxieties, and coordinate efforts across multiple states and communities. This isn't grassroots concern about inappropriate content. This is orchestrated political warfare using books as weapons. The scale and organization of contemporary book banning efforts far exceed historical precedents in American education. We're witnessing what many scholars consider a direct attack on democratic values and intellectual freedom that threatens the foundation of public education itself. The ultimate goal isn't protecting children from inappropriate content. The ultimate goal is controlling what future generations are allowed to know about their history, their society, and themselves. The pattern becomes even more disturbing when you realize that modern book banning operates with surgical precision that would have impressed the architects of the Index Librorum Prohibitorum. These aren't random attacks on literature. These are calculated strikes against specific narratives that challenge established power structures, just executed with 21st century efficiency and coordination. What we're witnessing today represents the evolution of censorship tactics refined over millennia of practice. Ancient emperors burned books in public squares to send clear messages about forbidden knowledge. Modern censors achieve the same results through bureaucratic processes, parent complaint procedures, and legislative mandates that appear democratic while serving authoritarian ends. The books disappear just as effectively, but the machinery of suppression operates behind a veneer of concerned citizenship and moral protection. The psychological warfare aspect of contemporary book banning reveals sophisticated understanding of how fear spreads through communities. Censorship advocates don't need to ban every challenging book. They just need to create enough uncertainty and intimidation to make librarians, teachers, and administrators self-censor. When educators become afraid to recommend certain titles or discuss controversial topics, the censors achieve their goals without officially prohibiting anything. This brings us to a case that demonstrates how translation itself can become a forbidden act. William Tyndale's English New Testament represents one of history's most dangerous books, not because of what it said, but because of who could suddenly read it. When Tyndale translated the Bible into common English in the early 1500s, he committed what religious authorities considered an act of revolutionary sedition. The Catholic Church had maintained control over Christian doctrine for over a millennium by keeping scripture in Latin, accessible only to educated clergy who could interpret its meaning for ordinary believers. Tyndale's translation shattered this monopoly by putting God's word directly into the hands of farmers, merchants, and craftsmen who could read for themselves what the Bible actually said. Church authorities understood immediately that vernacular translations posed an existential threat to their power. If people could read scripture themselves, they might develop personal relationships with religious truth that bypassed official church hierarchy. They might discover that some church teachings had no biblical foundation. They might start thinking independently about spiritual matters instead of accepting clerical authority without question. The response was swift and brutal. Thousands of copies of Tyndale's English New Testament were publicly burned after being smuggled into England. Church officials organized systematic searches to locate and destroy every copy they could find. Tyndale himself was eventually captured, strangled, and burned at the stake in 1536, but his translation had already begun transforming English Christianity in ways that would prove impossible to reverse. What makes Tyndale's case particularly revealing is how it demonstrates the power of language accessibility. The same religious text that was perfectly acceptable in Latin became dangerous sedition when translated into English. The content hadn't changed. The accessibility had changed. That shift in accessibility represented a fundamental redistribution of power from religious authorities to ordinary believers. This pattern of translation as subversion appears throughout history wherever authorities have tried to control access to foundational texts. The Protestant Reformation succeeded largely because reformers made religious texts available in local languages, breaking the Catholic Church's monopoly on biblical interpretation. Similar dynamics appear in political contexts, where authorities try to restrict access to legal codes, historical documents, or philosophical works by keeping them in languages that only educated elites can understand. Modern parallels exist wherever information remains locked behind paywalls, technical jargon, or academic credentials that ordinary people can't access. The democratization of knowledge through translation, simplification, or free distribution consistently threatens established power structures by enabling independent verification of official claims. Moving deeper into the machinery of intellectual control, we encounter Thomas Paine's Rights of Man, a work so threatening to British authorities that they tried and convicted the author in absentia for seditious libel. Paine's crime was defending the French Revolution and arguing that revolution becomes justified when governments fail their responsibilities to their people. The British government's response to Rights of Man reveals how authorities react when foundational political assumptions come under systematic attack. Paine wasn't just criticizing specific policies or particular leaders. He was questioning the entire theoretical basis for monarchical government and hereditary privilege. His argument that political authority derives from popular consent rather than divine appointment struck at the heart of 18th century British political order. What made Paine's work particularly dangerous was its accessibility. Unlike academic political theory written for scholarly audiences, Rights of Man was crafted for ordinary readers. Paine used plain language, compelling arguments, and emotional appeals that could persuade farmers, craftsmen, and labourers to question political arrangements they had previously accepted as natural and inevitable. The book's popularity terrified British authorities. Within months of publication, Rights of Man was selling faster than any previous political work in English history. Working-class political societies distributed copies, discussed Paine's arguments, and began organising around democratic principles that threatened the existing social order. The government recognised that ideas this powerful could not be safely ignored or quietly suppressed. The legal proceedings against Paine established precedents for prosecuting seditious libel that would influence censorship law for generations. The charge wasn't that Paine had lied about British government or made false accusations against specific officials. The charge was that he had undermined respect for established authority by encouraging people to think critically about political arrangements. This distinction between truth and sedition reveals something fundamental about how forbidden knowledge operates in political contexts. Authorities often suppress ideas not because they're false, but because they're true and dangerous. Paine's analysis of monarchical government was largely accurate, which made it threatening. A false or ridiculous critique would have been safely ignored. A compelling and accurate critique required legal suppression. Paine's case also demonstrates how intellectual exile functions as a form of censorship. By forcing him to flee England, authorities eliminated his physical presence while allowing his ideas to circulate in limited ways. This created a middle ground between complete suppression and free debate that served official interests by marginalizing dangerous thinkers while avoiding the publicity that would come from direct persecution. The long-term impact of Rights of Man illustrates why authorities were right to fear its influence. Paine's arguments contributed to democratic movements throughout the Atlantic world, influenced American constitutional development, and provided intellectual foundations for 19th century reform movements. Ideas that British authorities tried to suppress in the 1790s became mainstream democratic theory within decades. This pattern of delayed victory for suppressed ideas appears consistently throughout the history of forbidden knowledge. Authorities can temporarily restrict access to dangerous texts, but compelling ideas tend to resurface in new forms, different contexts, and unexpected places. The effort to suppress often increases long-term influence by creating martyrdom narratives that attract attention to ideas that might otherwise remain obscure. Contemporary parallels exist wherever governments prosecute whistleblowers, journalists, or activists for revealing information that embarrasses official policies. The specific charges may involve national security, privacy violations, or procedural infractions, but the underlying dynamic remains consistent. Authorities use legal mechanisms to punish people who make uncomfortable truths accessible to public scrutiny. The digital age has created new possibilities for both suppression and resistance that would have amazed historical censors. Information can be eliminated more efficiently than ever before through algorithmic manipulation, platform deactivation, and coordinated removal campaigns. But the same technologies also enable unprecedented preservation and distribution of forbidden knowledge through blockchain storage, peer-to-peer networks, and encrypted communication systems. Understanding these historical patterns becomes crucial for recognizing how censorship operates in contemporary contexts. The specific mechanisms change with available technology and social conditions, but the fundamental dynamics remain constant. Authorities identify ideas that threaten their power, generate justifications for suppressing those ideas, and implement systematic campaigns to eliminate access to dangerous knowledge. The most effective resistance strategies also remain surprisingly consistent across historical periods: preservation through hiding and copying, distribution through underground networks, translation into accessible language, documentation of suppression efforts, and most importantly, recognition that the attempt to forbid knowledge often reveals exactly which ideas pose the greatest threat to existing power structures. The books that survive systematic suppression efforts share common characteristics that illuminate how forbidden knowledge actually works. They tend to address fundamental questions about power, authority, and social organization. They offer alternative ways of understanding reality that challenge official narratives. They make complex ideas accessible to ordinary people rather than limiting discussion to educated elites. And they provide intellectual tools that enable independent thinking rather than passive acceptance of established wisdom. Perhaps most significantly, they demonstrate that the boundary between acceptable and forbidden knowledge shifts constantly based on changing power relationships, social conditions, and technological capabilities. Ideas that seem obviously true and harmless in one context become desperately dangerous in another. The same text can transition from revolutionary manifesto to conventional wisdom to historical curiosity as circumstances change. This fluidity reveals something profound about the nature of knowledge itself. Truth doesn't become false because authorities declare it forbidden, but access to truth can be systematically restricted through mechanisms that make certain ideas difficult or dangerous to encounter. The history of book destruction and censorship represents humanity's ongoing struggle over who gets to control the flow of information and ideas that shape how we understand ourselves and our world. The 10 cases we've explored represent just a tiny fraction of the systematic efforts throughout history to eliminate dangerous knowledge from human consciousness. Each represents a moment when those in power decided that certain ideas posed such fundamental threats to their authority that complete suppression was necessary. Each reveals specific mechanisms through which censorship operates and resistance strategies that enable forbidden knowledge to survive. What makes these patterns of suppression even more disturbing is how they reveal the true nature of power itself. Every book burning, every banned title, every forbidden text represents a confession by those in authority. They're admitting that their power depends on controlling what people know. They're acknowledging that their version of reality can't survive honest examination. They're revealing that their greatest fear isn't external armies or economic collapse, but the simple act of ordinary people thinking for themselves. This brings us to one of the most chilling examples of how modern technology amplifies ancient censorship techniques. The destruction of the National Library in Sarajevo during the Bosnian War in 1992 represents something far more sinister than collateral damage from military conflict. Serbian forces didn't accidentally hit the library during urban combat. They deliberately targeted it with sustained artillery bombardment, destroying between 1.5 and 3 million volumes in what scholars now recognize as one of the worst acts of cultural genocide in modern history. What makes this attack particularly revealing is its calculated precision. The library contained irreplaceable manuscripts, historical documents, and cultural artifacts that represented centuries of Bosnian, Serbian, Croatian, and Islamic intellectual heritage. These weren't military targets. They were the memory banks of an entire civilization. When soldiers shot at anyone who tried to save books from the burning building, they demonstrated that the destruction of knowledge was the primary objective, not an unfortunate side effect. The Sarajevo library bombing follows a pattern that appears throughout modern warfare. Attacking cultural institutions serves strategic purposes that go beyond immediate military objectives. Destroying a people's books, museums, and archives eliminates their connection to their own history. It severs the intellectual threads that bind communities together and maintain cultural identity across generations. It's a form of murder that targets not just individual lives, but collective memory itself. This technique of cultural obliteration has become increasingly sophisticated in contemporary conflicts. Digital archives can be eliminated with cyber attacks. Online libraries can be destroyed through coordinated hacking campaigns. Entire intellectual traditions can vanish overnight when servers fail or platforms disappear. The efficiency of modern knowledge destruction far exceeds anything possible during ancient book burnings. But the Sarajevo case also reveals how book destruction functions as psychological warfare. The message wasn't just aimed at the immediate victims. It was designed to terrorize anyone who might consider preserving or transmitting dangerous cultural knowledge. When authorities demonstrate their willingness to destroy irreplaceable intellectual heritage, they're warning others that no knowledge is safe from elimination if it threatens their agenda. This psychological dimension of censorship operates just as effectively in peacetime as during active warfare. Modern book banning campaigns don't need to physically burn text to achieve their goals. They just need to create enough fear and uncertainty to make people self-censor. When librarians become afraid to stock controversial titles, when teachers avoid discussing challenging topics, when publishers reject manuscripts that might generate controversy, the censors win without officially prohibiting anything. The digital age has created unprecedented opportunities for both preserving and destroying human knowledge. On one hand, information can be copied and distributed more easily than ever before. Banned books can be shared through encrypted networks, stored on distributed servers, and preserved in ways that make complete elimination nearly impossible. On the other hand, digital information is also more fragile and vulnerable to systematic destruction than physical books ever were. Consider how much of contemporary knowledge exists only in digital form. Academic research, historical documents, personal communications, cultural artifacts, all increasingly stored on servers controlled by private corporations or government agencies. A single decision by platform administrators can eliminate vast archives of human knowledge. Technical failures can erase decades of accumulated information. Coordinated attacks can target specific types of content for systematic removal. The concentration of digital knowledge in the hands of a few major technology companies creates vulnerabilities that historical censors could only dream about. When social media platforms decide to eliminate certain types of content, when search engines adjust their algorithms to suppress specific topics, when cloud storage providers refuse to host controversial materials, they exercise power over information access that exceeds anything achieved by traditional book burning. These 10 forbidden books reveal the eternal truth that Helen Keller understood when her own works burned in Nazi bonfires. You cannot kill ideas. Tyrants throughout history have tried and failed because the most dangerous knowledge always finds a way to survive. Every attempt at suppression only proves which ideas those in power fear most. Today, as new forms of censorship emerge with digital precision, remember that the books they're trying to ban are exactly the ones you need to read.